notes, and if I'm standing around, I'll flap about. First thing to say, yeah, I'm Sam from Friends of the Earth. Our focus on this has been predominantly the environmental aspects and also climate change, which I will speak about as well, which is sort of, especially, and also food safety concerns. And I know within this country at the moment, I think a lot of the momentum's been behind the sort of NHS aspect and things like that. But I think it's very important as part of this movement that we do broaden it to include the further concerns, because otherwise we could get scuppered before we've even accomplished anything just by the government making some clever decisions, which I'm surprised they haven't made yet, actually. So yeah, first of all, I'm going to talk a little bit about regulation and how it links in. And I think I'll quote, just to start with, so Pascal Lamy, the Director General of the former Director General of the World Trade Organization, a few of us here were actually at a talk with him a couple of weeks ago, and he said something quite interesting, so I'm sort of going to paraphrase him a little bit. He said, whilst authorities in Europe and America have given the impression that TTIP is just another trade agreement, the proposed agreement is a different beast. And as Glyn mentioned, it's because it's not about tariffs, it's about regulation. 80% of the gains are predicted to come from the harmonisation of regulation. And this is there's something that needs examining a bit, because they're referred to as these non-tariff barriers. So in its technical form, that means nothing to anyone. But you can actually look at what's considered a non-tariff barrier. The European Commission did a big study commissioned by a group called Economist prior to doing all of this, where they sort of quantified what all these different regulations are and how much they cost the economy. So just to give a couple of examples, the main non-tariff barrier for cosmetics companies coming to the EU, so US cosmetics companies, is the fact they're not allowed to test on animals. The other main, actually the biggest non-tariff barrier of all, is our approach to regulating chemicals entirely, so the REACH framework, which has led to us banning 1,300 chemicals in cosmetics, and the US ban about 13. So you can see there's big divergences here. And what I'm not going to do is say that all of these things are going to get scrapped. Those are just examples of what non-tariff barriers are. But I think before continuing, it's actually quite interesting to analyse how they've approached this and why it's so at odds with maybe what we need in reality. So they come at regulation as if it's a cost, and I think there's something here that's really important to understand. This regulation is a cost to business, but it's not necessarily a cost to the economy. The US did a study recently at a federal level looking at the cost and benefit of regulation, and the benefits of regulation came out about 4 to 1, so over the last 10 years, so about 80 billion to 20 billion. You can look at the hypotheticals of this. If a company dumps a load of chemicals into a river, it might cost them less to not have to be clearing it up straight away or to be putting in mechanisms, but in terms of the economy, it costs the health service, it costs the jobs of the fishermen down the river whose the fish have now died, it costs money of the government ultimately to clean it up, and then it costs the business ultimately when they do eventually get forced to do it, because usually crisis ultimately does beget better regulation. It's just once crisis hasn't been around for a while, our government seems to forget. And I think this is important in framing TTIP, because all of the benefits that they predict will come are based on these small benefits to business. There is no account taken of the cost it has to our economy, our environment and our society. So the sort of way it's been negotiated, I think there's two ways to approach it. There's the political negotiations in terms of how they want to do the regulation, and then there's the technical, how they actually go about it. So I'm going to talk briefly about both. So the political approach, we can see that there's very different things that are wanted by each side. So the US would really like us to lower our standards on food safety, to allow in GMOs, to allow in hormone-treated beef, and then the EU, on our part, are actually really pushing for public procurement to get opened up in the US. And the reason I'm mentioning both of these is, however much they say that there will not be sacrifices made, this is a trade agreement. They're not negotiating with themselves. The EU is not negotiating with the EU. The US is not negotiating with the US. If they want to compromise, which they will have to do to achieve some of these aims, things are going to get let slip ultimately. And there's a big fear that, as often is the case, it will be environmental and food safety things that go, especially on our side. And before going on to the technical explanation of how they go about this, I think it's also important to understand the difference in regulatory systems. So to caricature it, the EU has a precautionary approach, where the US has a scientific approach. What that means ultimately is the government have to prove it harms people before they can ban it, and in the EU can ban it if they have suspicion of harm. This is a caricature. It's not entirely true across the board. There are different levels, but it can be said to be true, especially of toxic chemicals, hormones in beef, GMOs and climate change, that the EU's precautionary regulation provides us with a higher standard of protection. The technical explanation of how they'll get away with this is initially they were looking for harmonisation, which would be just to join up the rules, but they've realised that that's not really possible. So the main way that they want to do it is through the approach of mutual recognition, which is we recognise each country, each block, so I keep saying country for EU, but obviously that's countries, each block as having equivalent standards in certain areas. I mean, there's acknowledgement that this isn't possible across the board, but there's definitely certain aspects, certain sectors they're really targeting. One of them being, actually just to take a step back, to be clear, in saying this, I'm not expecting a deregulatory big bang. It's a process, I think. It's just the biases that are inherent just get shifted further in the wrong direction. So in terms of what this looks like, we've seen a leaked chapter on food safety that's come out. So it's a proposed draft chapter from the EU, and they're proposing mutual recognition of both sides, and what that would ultimately result in is a lowering of port of entry inspections, say in the EU, of food that's been transported over from the US. And that's done on the basis that we just trust that on the US side that their inspections have been good enough. And there's sort of a thing here where if that was the case, maybe this wouldn't be a problem. But as we know, it's not the case. That at the moment their industry refuses to fund a regulatory body that would properly check the food. That becomes a big concern for us. And then also in going forward, so that was on regulation that's already there, but going forward there's the proposed Regulatory Cooperation Council, which is quite interesting. It's a sort of supranational body sitting between the two, where future laws would have to go through them, and they have to be judged on what is their impact on trade. So any law that comes through would have to be as trade unrestricted, that's not the right word, unrestrictive as possible. And this doesn't mean necessarily that headline laws won't get made. So if we have a law come through to protect something or other, it will still be framed as that law, but the mechanisms of how it's put in place will change. And an example of this, we can already see where this has happened with the European Fuel Quality Directive, which is a directive that's meant to help with climate change, which is to ensure that the emissions that go into transport fuels are lower than what they would be necessarily. The aim is to lower them by 2020. And the headline thing has stayed the same, but due to lobbying from Canada and US as part of the trade agreements that they've been negotiating, the mechanisms by which they measure the fuel quality has been weakened and watered down so as to allow tar sands to come through without there being any fixed penalty. So the headline remains the same. The Fuel Quality Directive is there to help lower emissions, but in practice it's going to now probably be quite ineffective. And that's how I foresee us going forward if this trade agreement comes through. Those pressures will get exerted more and more, combined with the European Commission's new prerogative to cut all red tape. 2 minutes, okay. Prerogative to cut all red tape. I think that's a toxic combination that just will lead to standards gradually slipping as we prioritise short-term cost, short-term benefit for business over the economy as a whole. I sort of describe it sometimes as, so this is a trade deal that's been promoted for the 21st century, but I'd rather argue that TTIP should instead be viewed as the death throes of the last. It's just them lashing out, trying to finally get through all the stuff that we've blocked so far. I was then going to talk about climate specifically. I've got 2 minutes, so I'll do it brief. Is that okay? Yeah. So climate specifically, because this is actually a bit of an interesting one. I've talked about all the technical stuff that's going on and how it'll gradually wear away at our protections, but with climate, it's actually quite explicit that it's going to be really bad for climate, because the EU have come out openly and said that they want the US to remove their 40-year ban or restrictions on exporting crude oil, and also to remove their restrictions on exporting liquid nitrogen gas. The argument for this being that Russia is posing a threat in terms of energy security, and that by opening up the US market it will help in the long term. And also they've been saying it will lower prices and that it won't affect climate change because it doesn't matter where when gas is burnt, because it's all the same. And they make no concession for the fact that all of this is shale gas, which we've still got a lot of suspicions about is a lot worse for the climate than normal gas, let's say. So why do they want it? To fend off Russia, will it actually help with Russia? No, because it's going to take them about 10 to 15 years to build up the infrastructure to actually export all of this gas. And will it help with the price of gas? No, because it's going to cost them a lot to turn it into liquefied gas and to transport it over. Will it make any difference to us whatsoever in terms of economic benefit? Absolutely not. Will it mess up the climate more? Yes, because that's another 10, 15 years of fossil fuel intensive infrastructure that we do not need when we should be focusing on other things. So I've summarised that a little bit here, but I'm happy to take more questions on that side of it later.
Thank you very much.